Hi, my name's Pearson and I head up new product development and general R&D for the Cotswolds Distillery. You may have heard of our Cotswolds dry gin, Old Tom, or our newly released Wildflower gin from April this year. These are our core gin releases, however the majority of our production is dedicated to making English single malt whisky, which is a category that's growing quite quickly now along with us. So I've worked at the Cotswolds Distillery since June 2018. I originally joined the bottling line after finishing my A-levels, and from there I progressed to the shop, to doing tours and also masterclasses after that. And then in October 2019 I managed to elbow my way into the lab, and I've been there ever since. So my day-to-day involves anything from the very first stages of recipe development for gins and other spirits, all the way to full-scale production, whether that be just for 35 bottles at a time of absinthe or a few thousand litres of Old Tom gin. But I'm here to talk to you about how we use the gin note principle, which is something developed by the Guild, as a kind of guide for our blend your own gin masterclasses. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the gin note by now, but just to give you an overview, it's an educational tool developed by the Guild to give a consumer the idea of the flavour profile of a gin, using values assigned to the following categories. So there's juniper, citrus, floral, fruity, herbal and spice. So it's a kind of bar chart format, and although these categories are fairly broad, on a surface level they're the same key parameters that someone like me is going to consider when we're developing a gin. So it's a really nice kind of common language between the consumer and the gin maker. So the gin note has been a fundamental component of our masterclasses, which have been running for over a year now. So when designing these classes, we knew what we wanted the outcome of them to be. We wanted people to be able to make their own gin to take home with them, but we weren't quite sure how to craft it into the best possible visitor experience. So naturally, we decided to take a rather boozy trip up to Edinburgh and St Andrews, and to take part in some masterclasses up there, as well as a few down in London, to do a little bit of research. And it became very clear very quickly to us what works and, more importantly, what doesn't. So we knew that we wanted our masterclasses to be a collection of all the things that we loved about the other ones that we attended. So to name a few, a fun but informal atmosphere, really excellent liquid quality, a really engaging and knowledgeable host, and generally a fun, informative experience in a comfortable setting. We wanted people to not only come away with a great gin that they loved, but also having learnt something in the process. So we did a few trials and test runs of different masterclass structures with friends of the company and staff, and eventually decided on our final masterclass structure, which I'll quickly run through now. So our masterclasses kick off with a G&T on arrival, and as people arrive, the host will run through a little bit of gin history and just have a general chat. So gin lane, beer street, that kind of thing. And then they will head off for a tour, so they will go to the main distillery building to meet Dolly and Lorelei, our 1200 and 500 litre Holsteins, and then also up to the lab, which most people don't get to see, and they also get to meet Valerie, who's our 50 litre Holstein in there as well. So once they've done that part of the tour, they'll pop back to the gin mezzanine, which is where I am now, and kind of commence the main part of the evening. So the general breakdown for the way that we would like people to blend their gins is to start with our three main botanicals, which are juniper, of course, coriander seed and angelica root. So they start with those, and to those they can choose a flavour base or a combination of flavour bases, and these bases are kind of based on the categories from the gin note itself, so citrus, spicy, herbal, floral, fruity, and those bases will form the main part of the gin. And to that, afterwards, they can add a few key botanicals. So these are individually distilled botanicals that they can add to give their gin a real personalised character. So our guests are first led through a tasting of our three distillates, so that those being the juniper, coriander, angelica root. So the juniper and the coriander are always very interesting to people, as many people don't get to try juniper distillate on its own very often, and also coriander. The angelica usually is a little bit more of a mixed crowd in terms of taste. If anyone's ever tried an angelica root distillate on its own, it can be a little bit too woody and rooty for some people. But we do this so that the guests can really appreciate every single element that goes into their gin, and to be able to see how they can kind of come together to form a final flavour profile. So once they've tasted those individual distillates, we will move on to the tasting of the bases. So these do make up the majority of the gin blend, and these are bases that we developed in the lab in order to be used for the masterclass. So these are based, as I said, on the gin note, And we've got citrus, spice, herbal and floral, and sometimes we also have a fruity base, which is a kind of berry-based flavour as well. Now, the reason the gin note is so useful here is because it really helps us to signpost those key flavours, and people who aren't very experienced in gin don't necessarily know what they're looking for. So to have it written down in front of them and also have the corresponding bases is a really helpful way to get people up to speed on gin tasting in a kind of quick way so that we can get on with the rest of the class. So one of the most important contributions that the gin note makes to our guests is giving them the language to use in order to describe the type of gin they like and the type of gin they don't like. And having that common language between the guest and the host is really important in order to create a better gin at the end of the process. A good example of this is that a lot of people don't necessarily know the difference between a herbal gin and a juniper-led gin. And so having the experience of tasting the juniper distiller and tasting the herbal base, but also having the language to go along with that, means that the guests are much better equipped to be able to make a gin that they're really going to enjoy. So another thing we've learned is that we need to get the decision process started very quickly in terms of the type of gin that the guest would like to make, as the more tasting that goes on, the more likely it is for people to forget what type of gin they're supposed to be making, and the decision-making part suddenly becomes very difficult, funnily enough. Saying that, this kind of moves on to the next part of the tasting, which is definitely the most chaotic, and that is where guests are allowed to taste as many of our individual botanical distillates as they would like. And so here they're really looking for 2 to 3, up to 5 really, key botanicals to add to their gin to really make it their own. But we have about 20 to choose from, and some guests are determined to try all 20 of them. So they are equipped with a little pipette and a tasting cup and can go around and blend for as long as they like. And by the end of it, most people have a pretty good idea of the bases they'd like to use and also their key botanicals that they would like to add. So hopefully it's clear to see why we chose to integrate the gin note as a tool in our masterclasses. It's creating that really nice common language between the hosts and the guests. And something that I really like is that it's a very plain language. I think a lot of us can fall victim to the kind of overly fancified language in the spirits industry that makes it quite inaccessible for people who haven't maybe done a lot of gin tasting before. So having that common language is a really, really good starting point. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the clearer that the brief is from the guest, the better the general outcome is when they're making their final gin. So once the majority of the tasting is complete, we help people to come up with their recipes, so how much of each distillate they're going to put into their blend. And the first blend that they make up is 50 millilitres, and some people will do this a few times before they get the recipe that they really like. And once everyone's happy with their gin recipe, we'll then discuss with them a garnish and a tonic that they can add, and we'll make them a little G&T as a kind of halfway point. And this is a really exciting moment for the guests because they get to try their very own gin for the first time, and quite an exciting moment for the hosts as well because we get a little break. And once those G&Ts have been enjoyed, it's kind of time to scale up from a 50ml recipe to a 450ml recipe. Everyone has to multiply theirs by 9. So usually we end up doing that for the guests, and then we let them loose with a range of glassware and kind of squint and hope for the best. But by the end of the evening, we usually successfully have everyone with 2 200ml bottles of their very own gin, along with a 200ml bottle of ours. And they also have 50ml left over, which we then make them a martini with. And that's a nice round off for our masterclass evening, followed by quite a lot of washing up. So where does the gin note really come into this outside of our masterclasses? In my opinion, as a consumer, the more information I can find out about gin, the better. And also as a person who makes gin, the more information I can give to someone in order to be able to enjoy a gin, the better as well. In fact, I'm sure a lot of my friends can tell you that they can't have a drink with me without having a mini chemistry lesson along with it. So I think any extra information is always a positive. Now the other thing that this can do is drive a slightly more discerning consumer, because if you're setting an expectation for the consumer, it also gives them an opportunity to agree or disagree with your gin note, meaning that they're going to be looking for and being more critical of the gin that they're drinking. And that in time could drive the quality of gin upwards and weed out the ones that maybe aren't quite as good. So in comparison to the way we normally develop gins, the masterclasses are slightly different. So when I'm developing a gin for the distillery, generally I will start with 1 litre alembic still, something like the one just here, and I will make anywhere between kind of 5 to 7 recipes, that I will then present in an MPD meeting, which we have weekly. And from there, those gins will be whittled down and developed a little bit further until we come out with our final product. The difference being that each one of those samples that I present in that meeting will be a completely new distillation with the recipe tweaked, but the distillation is completely new. Rather than in the masterclasses where if someone needs a little bit more of something in their gin, they can just take a pipette and add some more. Now this has its pros and cons. Equipment wise, it's much more straightforward to do a blending class, and if anyone's run a still before, you'll know what I'm talking about. The first time I ran a still, it was really, really exciting for me, but you might know that it's only really the first kind of 10 minutes to 20 minutes that's quite exciting. After that, you have to wait for your distillate to slowly drip through, and there's not really a lot to do in the meantime. So we decided that a more hands-on blend your own gin class rather than a distill your own gin class would be better suited to the type of experience we were looking for. And the other bonus with being able to blend your own gin is that people can do a few different gins before they finish on the one they like. As I said right at the beginning, one of the key outcomes that we wanted from the classes was for people to have a gin that they really genuinely enjoyed. Each distillate we provide in the masterclass was developed individually to make sure that we are making the most of the botanicals we're using and that the liquid is a good reflection of that botanical's best flavour profile. So not only is this a little bit more time consuming, it also did give us the opportunity to make distillates that were a little bit more interesting and kind of caricature in flavour, meaning that when the guests were going to blend with them, they definitely stood out in the final gins. It also meant that guests who maybe don't have so much experience with tasting could identify different botanicals a little bit easier when those flavours are much kind of brighter and easier to distinguish in the distillates, even at 42%, which is the ABV that we use for all the gin. So this meant for each botanical, we didn't take a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of the distillation. We had to choose an appropriate botanical load, an appropriate heads and tails cut, and also some of the botanicals involved a maceration beforehand as well. So all of those elements meant that it was time consuming, but a really, really important part of one of the key things for our masterclasses, which is the liquid quality. We went to far too many masterclasses where the liquid just wasn't up to scratch, and even if you have a great host, if you take home a gin that you don't like at the end of the day, then it just makes the experience just not quite as good as it could have been. So we made sure that our liquid quality was as good as we could possibly get it, and that meant a lot of tasting and a lot of distilling as well. But we came out with some really, really great ones, so I'll share with you some of the favourite distillates that we have now. So unfortunately, as this is an online Ginposium, you won't be able to try these today, but I'll give you an idea of the most popular distillates that we have for the masterclass. Number one definitely being strawberry. So we use freeze-dried strawberries, and again we run it in the 1 litre alembic still. And this is definitely the most popular distillate, often paired with the citrus base or sometimes the herbal base as well. But strawberry is definitely number one, closely followed by cacao or chocolate. It gives a really lovely smooth mouthfeel, and the same as the strawberry in the sense that you get a real natural sweetness coming through from that distillate. We also have kaffir lime, which is really lovely and refreshing for people who like those kind of zestier gins. Grapefruit is another great one for that, and it is also one of the main botanicals in our Cotswolds dry gin, so lots of people are really keen to use the grapefruit. Pink pepper, again, a really popular one if you like a kind of spicier gin or a more kind of citrusy gin. It's a really interesting flavour and actually one of my favourites. And then in terms of bases, the general theme is that people like a naturally sweet base for their gin. So the spice base, which has a lot of cassia in it, gives it that natural sweetness, is really popular, as well as the floral base, which we did consider calling the sweet base, and that is a blend of vetiver, cornflowers and chamomile. And that has a lovely kind of rich floral sweetness to it as well, and there's a bit of maceration involved in that recipe too. So while we were developing these distillates from the masterclass, we also managed to develop a much deeper understanding of the botanicals that we're using and how they behave, and also where the flavours peak in the distillation, which is a really important part of making sure we get the best part of them into the distillate. Now that was really a luxury for us to have the time to do that, as it's not very often that we get to sit down and really just work on one botanical and learning everything about it and running it so many times through the still in order to really plot that where that flavour peak is. Now going forward, I would really like to extend this research and plot those peaks and almost be able to put together the landscape for a gin and where those flavours come through. before you even get to putting any distillate or NGS or whatever else in the still. It would be a really nice way to be able to have an idea of what your outcome is going to be before you even put anything into the still. So, in conclusion, I think that the gin note can make a really positive impact on visitor experiences, such as the Blend Your Own Gin masterclasses, and it's a really great tool for brands to be able to approach that kind of flavour dialogue with their consumers in a very plain speaking way that is actually informing them rather than just trying to sell to them. And although it might be quite a simplistic outline, it really is a great way of bringing people into the category and making sure that anyone can talk about gin in a well-informed way and really making it an inclusive experience. Thanks so much for listening, and if you have any comments or questions, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.